Tonight. My name is Karen Tucker, and I'm CEO of the Churchill Club. Welcome to our program, When Push Turns to Pull. Our speakers are John Seely Brown and John Hagel, co-chairs of the Deloitte Center for the Edge and co-authors of the groundbreaking new book, The Power of Pull. Out on the street now for less than a month, their book is already receiving very high praise from leaders in government and business. And in fact, today I was watching the Amazon.com rankings, and it was hovering there under the 13 of the most popular books today in 3 different categories. And in fact, copies of the book will be made available tonight, in case you haven't noticed that, for your convenience. Our moderator is Tim OReilly, founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media. John, and Tim, thank you very much for being here and welcome.
Thank you very much for having us.
And I would also like to thank our sponsor, Deloitte, whose support of the Churchill Club dates back to 1986, and we very much appreciate their participation and partnership with the club. So please join me in thanking Deloitte for making this program possible. Quickly, a few Churchill Club announcements. Our next program will be held on Wednesday, May 19. It is the 12th annual Top 10 Tech Trends debate. It's one of our most popular programs, and we have Vinod Khosla, Steve Jurvetson, Ron Conway, Esther Dyson, and Kevin Effersey, who are going to stick out their necks and predict the trends that will begin to start to take shape in the 12 months ahead. And you, the audience, will be able to vote on those trends, as well as which of the 5 pundits will become trend idol of the year. For 24 years and counting, the Churchill Club has been the leading business and technology forum located in Silicon Valley, presenting what's new, next, and not known. And we are a 6,500-member supported organization. If you are interested in membership, if you're not a member and you enjoy tonight's program, we certainly encourage you to consider becoming a part of our organization. You can plug in at the corporate level, the individual level, even student options are available for you, and you can always find the information that makes it easy for you at churchillclub.org. And finally, one last announcement, a reminder that if you are tweeting tonight, please use hashtag or # Churchill Club, and check your program for other @ and hashtags that are relevant, the Twitter codes that are relevant for tonight. So it's now my privilege to introduce Tim OReilly, founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media, a 32-year-old thriving business that has weathered 4 recessions. And Tim is featured in the cover story of this month's Inc. magazine. And because of his uncanny ability to see and help materialize trends, they called him the Oracle of Silicon Valley. He's scooping me. Early in its life, Tim's company enjoyed the explosion of the market for computer books that coincided with the rise of the PC, many of which are possibly in the collection of the Computer History Museum in this very building. If you're thinking, yes, but there's a decline in atomic books, don't worry. O'Reilly published the first ebooks 23 years ago, and he and his company have more experience than anyone in that market, and they are currently publishing hundreds of titles for iPhone, iPad, and Kindle, and also directly from their website. O'Reilly Media organizes more than a dozen large conferences and has a wide array of other businesses as well, such as an online education division, a magazine called Make, and a venture capital firm that invested in Blogger, the most popular blogging platform in the world. And Tim's own widely read blog is called O'Reilly Radar, which you'd be well served to read regularly. If you go to his blog tonight, you'll learn what Tim means when he talks about the state of the Internet operating system. It's also the topic of his keynote at the Web 2.0 Expo in San Francisco, I believe tomorrow evening. And just as he's known for advising others, Tim continues to think bigger and bigger and more creatively. As part of his Government 2.0 initiatives in D.C., he is putting on 2 conferences this year, but it doesn't end there. He's also advising the Department of Health and Human Services on how to bring community health data into applications that people use every day, such as Wikipedia, the various search engines, Yelp, et cetera. And he is also working with the State Department on how to train people around the world to use technology for civic engagement. And on the personal side, you already heard it. You did scoop me. He bakes scones, and he makes his own strawberry jam. And if the result of that is half as good as the other things that he does, I'll bet they're really, really good. Let's give a warm Churchill Club welcome to Tim OReilly.
Well, it's a little hard to follow up on that intro. I've been, let me just say, start by introducing John and John by saying this. You guys know, don't you, that the world has been changing at a rapid pace over the last, 3 or 4 decades, and it's a very different world than the one that we saw, that we grew up in. The gentlemen to my left are among those who have seen most deeply into the nature of the changes that are driving our society, the rise of networks, the influence of technology, the fundamental economic changes that we're facing. These guys think deeply, they see deeply, and perhaps most importantly, they share what they see in a way that helps others to understand the forces that are acting on them. Edmund Schlossberg once said, the skill of writing is to create a context in which other people can think. These guys have probably done more to help other people think about the changing nature of the world around us than anyone I know. Now,
can we just quit?
we can, a few of the perhaps biographical details, although, you guys could just, if you use the power of pull, you could find them for yourself. So maybe we should just stop there. But they are co-chairmen of the Deloitte Center for the Edge, which is really a think tank and consulting group that does research into the sort of intersection of business and technology, and particularly the way we're seeing new behaviors emerge at that edge and that intersection. And I think they're doing remarkable work as demonstrated in this book. Now, I will say one thing, was mention of ebooks, and they're very great, but you can't get your friends to sign them. And so I highly recommend that you go out there and get a book and do. I've already got John Hagel to sign mine for me, but I got to make sure that JSB signs it too. So, and then you guys too can do that afterwards. How many of you out there have already read this book? Okay, so a good number of you. So, but you'll be treated to hearing the stories firsthand. So let's move directly to the book. And I guess I wanted to start with the way that we as a species tend to underestimate how technology shapes our culture. We learned how to read, and we forgot how to memorize and recite poetry. We moved to cities, we forgot how to grow our own food. We got cars, we forgot how to ride horseback and how to walk long distances without making a big deal of it. Henry Ford gave us not only the car, but the 5-day work week so that we could enjoy vacations and have time to take motor car rides in the country. So you guys in this book are really looking at the way technology is exploding so many of the things we take for granted about the way business works, about the way education works, about the way organizations work. And I wonder if either or both of you could just start with sort of just the high-level summary for those who haven't read the book of that core idea of the power of pull. Go ahead.
Well, I think the starting point in terms of technology is the notion that for the first time, the book makes an assertion that for the first time we are in history, at least recorded history, we're facing an infrastructure that is not stabilizing. If you think of any other technology infrastructure, electricity, telephone, you had a burst of innovation, and then fairly rapidly you had stabilization. And so you could start to think about the infrastructure required to deliver that technology, and then everybody else could figure out what to do with it and how to change the behaviors and the social organization to support that technology. Here we don't see that stabilization. The core technology components are continuing to drive forward at exponential rates. It creates, at one level, a huge amount of instability, and we would argue growing pressure. I think at one level the book is about the growing...
I want to come back to exponential later, because that term is used very loosely, and I'm not sure that it's not sigmoidal instead. But we need to we need to talk about that.
Fair enough.
But go on.
So I think at one level the book is about the growing pressure and stress that is created by these new technology infrastructure. But at another level, we're talking about the opportunity that it creates, and the power of pull is actually understanding the new management techniques and new techniques in our personal lives, where we can actually turn this period of enormous stress into some very significant opportunity where we're more effectively achieving our potential than ever before.
But getting specific, the book opens with a wonderful story about Dusty Payne and a group of young surfers who have really been able to transform their own lives. And it kind of seems to be a summary of so many of the ideas in the book. Perhaps you could tell that story?
You know, it also gets us into the whole role of serendipity as well, because this amazing story started by the fact that I spend, luckily, 3 months a year in Maui. And I ended up having dinner almost every night with this family, 200 feet from my house in Maui, that turned out to be the center of this story. Although I had been with Dusty for 2 or 3 months before I ever kind of recognized that he was this passionate, high performer, ultra high performer surfer. So the story is how these 4 to 5 kids come together, and they decide at about 14 to 15 years old, the only thing they care about is surfing. And they want to become world-class professional surfers. Now, I happen to know their parents, and their parents said, "You've got to be kidding me, right? I mean, that's not a profession." And they said, "Trust me, it will become." Now, what's surprising is that Maui, Hawaiian island, has never, ever produced a world-class surfer. The world-class surfings come from Oahu, the North Shore, et cetera, but never, ever from Maui. Now, these 5 kids decided to come together as a cohort group and take peer-based learning deadly seriously, and let's say to themselves, how do we use all the tools of social media, all the ways that we can to kind of amplify our ability to learn. So the obvious things they do is they get all the major DVDs on professional surfers, they study them frame by frame by frame, they go down, they run down the street, literally, down the hill, try some of these ideas out. They start using video cameras themselves. They're videoing each other. They dash up the hill next door to me. They sit in the living room, literally, slap it into iMovie, start going through frame by frame, frame at a time in iMovie, looking at each particular move, and see kind of what they did wrong, what they did right, because it's a highly instinctual type of game. And so that would then happen. And then they kind of recognized, well, we got to figure out, and these guys are all now kind of key aerial surfers. The interesting thing about an aerial surfer is the thing that's most valuable in terms of the real estate is the bottom of the surfboard. The bottom of the surfboard, when they do their amazing maneuvers, every professional photographer is out there shooting, guess what? When they do the leaps. That's the bottom of the board. And so they began to realize doing that, they could actually make some money because they got so good at this. But they began to realize, just like in Silicon Valley, a lot of innovation comes from looking at adjacencies. So they decided to go out and they study, what do they study? Skateboarding is an obvious one, surfboarding, motocrossing. One of the latest moves that Dusty has perfected came directly out of motocrossing. And so they kind of started looking around this way. And then they also recognized as a key part of the work that John and I do in the book as well, is that there are local ecosystems that are perfecting things around the world. And so if you really want to pick up new ideas, you've got to visit these ecosystems, these spikes that we call them. And in fact, Tom Friedman is famous for saying the world is flat. Well, Richard Florida says, well, the world is really spiky. Well, by the way, you can actually make a win out of both of those, because by being flat, if you find the spikes, you can connect the spikes together. So they actually connect, they go around to all the spikes. In fact, if you ever talk to Dusty, it'll be on Skype. He'll be in Bali this now, headed to South Africa. So he follows wherever the tremendous surfing actually goes. All this stuff is kind of then being recorded. Now they such so hot material that now they have professional videographers out there shooting for them. It just accelerates them even more. And the story keeps going on and on and on. What's particularly interesting, though, is if just Dusty became a world champion, well, is an idiot savant. But every one of these kids has become a world champion, except one. And the one who's not is probably, maybe by the experts, the best surfer in the world today. But he has Asperger's. So he doesn't like to get on planes, doesn't like to travel. If you interview him, let me tell you, get him in the water first. Because he's only comfortable in the water. He is a fish. And so basically all 5 of these kids simultaneously, by collaboration, pulling each other up by the bootstrap, giving them ideas, pulling ideas from all over the place, pull, finding the adjacencies, pulling, they have now become the best of the best. And it's just a very dramatic story to us that got us kind of going on this whole theme.
Well, it's such an interesting story because it encapsulates so many different elements. So first there is this idea of incredible passion and the quest for extreme performance. We were talking at dinner about the power of trying something really, really hard. And so I want you to spend some time on that. But I also want to think about the networking aspects of this, the ability to get, first of all, to see what other people were doing. Vastly increased. The fact that you can get all these long tail, surfing videos, whether on DVD or on YouTube, so they're able to watch, probably 10,000 hours of tape, going back to what was the book about the 10,000 hours, Gladwell's last book, Outliers. They're basically able to get, there's the feedback loops, the ability to film themselves, which we're now starting to see.
And run in slow motion.
The whole quantified self aspect of this, where they're able to measure and learn and study. And then there's the aspect of the outbound networks, where as they start to share their own video, they're in fact contributing to others like themselves who are trying to learn. And it's actually the act of sharing that creates the visibility for them, that then creates an economic engine for them to start to travel and be supported in their passion.
And you get tremendous reciprocity through that travel.
That's right. So that reciprocity aspect and the network. And then, of course, increasingly they have acquired the resources to get more, it's like a snowball rolling downhill.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's a tremendous dynamic that starts to develop, and I think that Silicon Valley is one of the few places in the world that understands this. You innovate by being willing to fail again, and learn from those failures. I mean, let me tell you, these kids fail all the time, and it doesn't disturb them one iota. In fact, they study, they video their failures. And by the way, failing on some of these big waves is kind of messy. Sometimes it's really messy. But one of the things we've been able to look at is the speed at which a new idea, with a move, by the way, these moves are very, very subtle moves, propagates around the world, we figure about 48 hours. Now let's go back to the collaboration. And John, why don't you talk about the Maverick and the final move and with the 6 guys?
Well, it's an interesting story related to big wave surfing again. As most of you know, very close to here, we have one of the biggest big wave surfing areas, Mavericks. And it was interesting because there was one guy who was brave enough to actually go out and surf those big waves off of Mavericks. And for 15 years, he surfed that big wave alone.
That's kind of an amazing story.
He couldn't convince anybody else to go out with him. It was too scary. And by the way, if you crash on Mavericks, you don't crash on sand, you crash on rock. So there's a reason to be scared. So 15 years he surfed this alone, and finally he was able to bring some other people out. But for those 15 years, he got better and better. Obviously, with more and more practice, he did the 10,000 hours, but he did it alone. And he had no contact with anybody else around the world. In contrast, you had a whole group of surfers in various breaks in Hawaii who were surfing together and forming really local teams that were working with each other and coaching each other how to perfect their practice. So this guy in Mavericks, he learned and he performed much better after 15 years of surfing. But because he was alone, he was still not performing anywhere near what these other surfers were doing because they had this constant reinforcement and feedback loops that really helped them.
So,
Oh, just a second. I mean, what I wanted to get at is the final move and the final competition. Yeah.
So, well, as many of you know, they have an annual competition at Mavericks. They announce it 48 hours ahead of time because the waves have to be exactly right.
You got to come from all over the world in that 48 hours.
Everybody converges in 48 hours on these breaks. And in the next to the most recent surf contest, they had the three finalists who were swimming out to surf the final wave. And as they surfed out, they basically made an agreement. They said, look, you know, we all deserve this prize. Whoever gets it, we're going to split the prize among the three of us. And basically, even though intense competition at one level, there was this sense of camaraderie that was just really ultimately prevailed and said, we're just going to share this.
And that, to me, captures the spirit completely.
Yeah.
I mean, fierce competition and fierce collaboration and willingness to share even of the goodies.
so that's just happening with like Amazon and Google and Apple right now.
You know, as a matter of fact,
They're going to split
so.
the prize.
You know, you guys are clearly, you know, you don't go into the clients of the Deloitte Center for the Edge and tell them to take up surfing.
Oh, not so quick. Sorry, Eric.
You know, when you start to take these ideas and apply them in a business context, you know, it's pretty easy to see how they might apply to just as easily to some young kids who have a brilliant startup idea in tech or you know, or even as some kind of social kind of business. But your clients are typically going to be big companies that you know, have an existing way of doing things. What do you tell them? What can they learn from these stories?
A lot.
A lot. But the first thing we do before we tell them the stories is we show them one chart, which basically came out of the Shift Index we produced last year.
Yeah.
And it was the first attempt that we know of to actually look at corporate performance over a long period of time in the United States. Basically, we went from 1965 to today, and we looked at return on assets for all public companies in the United States. So every public company, not a sample, every one, since 1965 to today. Return on assets has basically collapsed. It's fallen by 75%, and it's been a sustained, significant erosion. There is no evidence of it leveling off, certainly no evidence of it turning around. We show that one chart, and basically we say, what you're doing today is broken. This chart is pretty strong testimony. It's the Red Queen effect to the nth degree. The Red Queen ran harder and harder to stay in the same place. We are running harder and harder and falling farther and farther behind.
Well, I don't know. I
This
think
graph-
the Red Queen just learned how to make funny money.
Well, that's
So it
one
looked
way
like
out
she
of
wasn't
it.
staying in the same place.
But you know, I mean, this analysis is actually
That's Queen Goldman, right?
no comment. You know, you might think the objection that is an aggregate measure. So we decided to unpack big aggregate. And so we looked at the top quartile and the bottom quartile. Okay, because obviously in an average you can disguise anything. Curious thing is in the top quartile, the same thing, down. Doesn't go down as fast, nowhere near as fast as the bottom quartile, and the gap between the top and the bottom is increasing. But nevertheless, even the top quartile companies are losing through time in ROA.
Now, this is size of company.
We've looked at all public companies. We tried all kinds of permutations. So one of the pushbacks was, well, maybe this is the largest companies, they're brain dead, they're dying. The smaller companies are actually succeeding. Now, we don't have access to private company financials, but we looked at different sizes of public companies. There is absolutely no difference.
Now, U.S., Europe, worldwide?
Just U.S. so far. We're actually going to produce this shift index every year and update it for the U.S. And actually, towards the end of this year, we're going to do a global index and really try to look at comparative trends over.
A couple of things come to mind. Obviously, in your book, you're making the case that the industrial modes of organization aren't working anymore. But is that a scale effect? Is it, I mean, some people, I was just reading a piece the other day, it was, attributing this to the fact that our economy has been fueled by cheap energy, and that's starting to go away. There are a lot of potential factors. What do you trace it to?
Well, ultimately, our view, and this is, again, part of the shift index analysis, we trace it to two forces that have been playing out for decades. One is this digital technology infrastructure continuing to improve performance. The economic effect of that is to reduce barriers to entry and barriers to movement on a global scale. It is, again, in business terms, intensifying competition. There's more and more competition emerging. And in parallel to that, you have another force, which is a public policy trend that's been playing out on a global level since World War II, which is economic liberalization, which again, in economic terms, is reducing barriers to entry and barriers to movement.
So the pie is getting bigger, but any particular company is having a harder and harder time maintaining their share of the pie.
Let's unpack that a little bit more, because it turns out that productivity has been going up as ROA is going down. You might ask, this doesn't make much sense. And it turns out that there's some interesting factors happening here. One is, in fact, that the customer is actually increasing in power.
Yeah.
So in some sense, the customers are getting a better deal than ever, given that in some sense at the expense.
Yeah.
But for this audience, what's particularly interesting is that the knowledge worker is getting more of the rent. So the extreme talent is walking away with more of the rent.
Okay, that's a key point. Okay, so back to this question. You've got a client, and do you go in and just tell them, hey, shift happens? Or do you,
we say it differently, but yes.
Or do you give them advice? What advice do you give them about how to deal with it?
Well,
that's kind of, I think, obviously the heart of the book is, okay, this is happening, and here's what you got to do to respond. So.
Yeah, and so I think, again, one of the key lessons I've learned from decades of working in change management for large organizations is most of them fail, and the few that succeed largely when there is a clear and present threat on the horizon. So showing that kind of chart is really critical to getting attention and conviction. Right. Once we do that, basically it's a question of starting to walk them through examples. There's a conceptual framework that we think is pretty interesting, but most executives rely on examples. They want to see and hear about a company, not just how it theoretically could work out. So we walk through, and the first level of pull that we talk about is this notion of access. It's finding resources and people when you need them, asking the question and getting the resources quickly. The obvious example that we all know is Google in the search area. What we do is we take that into a business context, and we look at companies that are emerging, largely actually in Asia, particularly one that we're very fond of called Lianfeng, which most Americans have never heard of. They have 10,000 business partners on a global scale all around the world, and they have created, in essence, a pull platform where on demand they can pull together the right partners out of those 10,000 to serve a particular customer's needs. They're serving apparel designers and doing very complex apparel manufacturing on a global scale. That starts to get attention. 10,000 business partners, most executives in the U.S. couldn't conceive of that. We, for the past several decades, have been reducing the number of partners we have in supply chains, not expanding them.
Right.
And
I would assume that also means that they're probably 10,000 contact points, that it's not command and control from the top.
Right.
It's basically small teams making individual products who have access to that network.
Right.
And I assume it's really a two-sided network. They're really a sort of a central node in a chain. And they're reaching out to their suppliers. They're reaching out then to their network on the other side of distribution.
And in fact, it's kind of a very unusual way, if you look at the Constitution underlying how this network is run. They have a very interesting principle. First of all, we can go in later how they run this thing as a way to accelerate learning, because they kind of make available, have a dashboard, going back to our public policy stuff. And so, every one of the companies has a dashboard, and that dashboard is rendered public to all the other companies. Okay, so you can see how well you're doing relative to other companies in your local ecosystem and across the world.
Right.
But perhaps the most unusual thing is, if you join their network, here's what they say: we guarantee you. By the way, it's a loosely coupled network. I mean, these are modules in a loosely coupled system. If you join our network, we will guarantee we'll always take 30% of the output of your factory. But we also guarantee you we will never take more than 70%. We do not want you to become beholden to us. You got to go out.
70% is pretty beholden, John.
70%? Well, but okay, but 30 to 70 is actually a reasonable interval. But the curious thing is by saying that, what really happens is, this is a win-win situation, because Li and Fong wants to look at their competitors and see, first of all, you're learning from our competitors this way. Okay, so again, all these things come back to ways to kind of accelerate the learning across this entire ecosystem, a concept that is foreign to the American ecosystems.
I think there's a couple of interesting things in here. One is this idea of accelerated learning. Are you guys familiar with the whole lean startup idea that we've been hearing out about Silicon Valley? It's a wonderful concept that Eric Ries talks about, of minimum viable product. And he describes minimum viable product as the product that is gives you the quickest validated learning about customers.
Right.
And so like, how do you put something out that you can iterate on that is valuable? And it sounds like these guys have really worked that idea.
Right. And that's where the real value
It's not
lies.
software, but it works that same way. And there's a whole set of competence there. You need to be able to instrument what's happening. You need to be able to share the knowledge. And of course, which is, as you say, totally at odds with our sort of trade secret, lock it down, only a few people know the secret sauce kind of thinking. It's instead, learn faster, not keep your knowledge to yourself.
Right.
And I just want to add two other things that get the attention of executives when we talk to them. First of all, it didn't get a lot of attention in the press here in the United States, but about 4 months ago, Walmart announced that they were forming a strategic partnership with Li and Fong to do their apparel sourcing through Li and Fong. Now, if you ever went to business school and read about world-class supply chain management, Walmart was the model that everybody pointed to. They have now declared defeat and gone to Li and Fong and said, you need to do this for us. So that gets attention of Western executives. Then the pushback we get from Western executives is, oh, okay, that's really interesting, but that's apparel. Give me a break, we're in whatever industry. And so what we've done is go out and study a whole set of companies that are emerging, that are in such diverse industries as motorcycles, financial services, agricultural products, consumer electronics.
Yeah, no, it is always amazing how companies have a reason for explaining why,
why
they're
it
different.
doesn't apply.
We have that a lot with ebooks, for example. We put out all of our ebooks without DRM. And the New York publishers say, "Oh, but you're a technical publisher. Your lessons don't apply to us." And it sounds like
it may be worth to unpack a little bit in Chongqing, the motorcycle industry, which a couple of us are motorcyclists, so we particularly like this. But some time ago, in 1992, I think it was, basically Honda and Suzuki decided to move into Chongqing, which is the area where most of these motorcycles are made, and said that we're going to use the same suppliers, and we're going to build our motorcycles there. Okay, so we get all the cost advantage of the same players. Okay, but of course, coming from a Western perspective, although they're Japanese, they said, okay, we're going to give you the designs, And now we expect the supply network to adhere to those designs to build products precisely to our specifications. Okay? What eventually happened, it was a major assembler there that decided to break out on his own and said, let's try this differently. Suppose in Chongqing, which by the way is a medium-sized city, I don't know how many people here know it, there's only 25 million in that city, but what we're going to do is we're going to get together in the tea houses. And we're going to hover around a tea table, and we're going to look at this, and we're going to figure out how we might actually do overall optimization in terms of what I can do versus what you can do. And how basically, I may be able to compensate what you can't do by covering it over here and so on and so forth. So they ended up kind of coming up with this bottom-up design that actually optimized the capabilities of those set of suppliers. And then they would submit that design to the assembler that would then approve it.
All right.
Now what ended up happening is we're basically in the same cycle. Honda was turning it out for $700. They were turning it out for $200. End of story. Honda, Suzuki got wiped out of Vietnam in 2 years, as I recall. And it's just a sense of saying, like, what happens if we actually get together? And they were just using the social space of the tea house to do this, to try to figure out local optimization. Now, what's curious here in Silicon Valley is we quietly do that too. Yeah. If you actually want to do software and silicon together, we take an initial guess at how to parse the system, and then somehow the software guy's having a very hard time, and I'm saying, as a chip designer, oh hell, that's your problem. I can probably do a little bit more on my chip, do this. And so we kind of negotiate around that boundary what is actually an overall optimization, starting from an initial decomposition.
So, if you follow the logic here, though, of the shift index, does this reverse any of that, or is it just, a new way to survive at, kind of a new level? Does, the old, are we sort of hung up on the old model where you could get to a certain kind of scale and extract these outsized rents? Does this fundamentally change the business equation, or is it more that, if you learn the new rules, you can go back and be fat and happy again?
I mean, we do have a sense that over time the real power of pull is in the third level of pull, which has to do with how you improve performance more rapidly. And the provocative proposition that we offer, I actually started my career at a firm called Boston Consulting Group, and they made their fame and fortune based on one chart, and it was basically the experience curve chart. It showed how performance improved in industry after industry. The issue was that it's a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you have, the longer you have to wait to get the next increment of performance improvement. So part of the stress we believe we're feeling in our daily lives and in our corporate lives has to do with this diminishing returns phenomenon. Yeah. We think there's actually an opportunity using the techniques of pull and organizing into different kinds of spaces to turn that on its side and create increasing returns to performance improvement, where the more people who participate, the more rapidly you learn.
So I'm still kind of hung up on a little bit on the idea that existing firms can sort of learn these techniques and somehow everything will be hunky-dory. Because it seems to me that there's a lesson in the story of Dusty and his friends. And we talked a little bit about it earlier, which was this idea of, passion, extreme performance, and trying to do something really hard. And, when I look at the great companies that I know, they have a mission. Microsoft in its glory days, was trying to put a computer on every desk and in every home back when the giants of industry were saying, who cares, it's just a toy. When Google started, people had written off search engines, and they said, no, we want to create access to all the world's information. And there's a lot of things that they've done that, people don't understand why they're doing it. Why are they so fixated on automated translation or speech recognition or scanning all the world's books? These things don't make business sense. But they do make sense in the context of Dusty and his friends. They're trying to do something hard. They have a passion for a really big idea. And so one of the questions I have, and this is, it relates back to what we ask of companies. Are we asking, our companies and our individuals to work on what really matters and to work on stuff that's hard, that is world-changing? Or is that lack of performance because, we're settling to basically becoming mediocre as companies? We get mediocre performance because we have mediocre goals.
Right. I think there's a whole set of things happening. To some extent, and we'll talk about later how this plays out in education, but, in the 20th century, we basically trained people in order to be able to kind of work in corporations so that they would kind of be copacetic and shaped by the corporation.
Right.
Well, first thing we're saying is we've got to flip that whole equation. As Jay here would also agree, the whole question is how do you start recognizing the fact that individuals should be shaping corporations, not corporations shaping individuals, number one. That then drives you to thinking about edge strategies.
Right.
Okay? Now, there are multiple ways to play out the edge. Now, the curious kind of sideline in one of our whole chapters here is the role of the top manager in the worlds that we're talking about walking into. His or her job is to find the passionate people and let them come to the edge and build their own world. Okay? So find the passionate people that have fire in their belly, and let's figure out a way to actually exploit that or leverage that in terms of kind of edge-type things.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the edge a moment. Because classically, we're all used to the notion, coming from Xerox PARC, I know it damn well, having kind of a skunk work on the edge, and then expect the skunk work to infect the mothership. And after AT&T, Xerox, a whole bunch of companies have tried that, the story is not overly pretty.
Yeah.
Okay? So we're suggesting in this book, again, just like John flipped the learning curve to a collaboration curve, maybe we should look at how do you structure the edge so that the edge can pull the core to the edge rather than having the core pull the edge to it.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Now, that's wonderful poetry, you might say. Why is that possible? And the reason it's possible now, and we have a bunch of people in this room that are examples of this, we can now use, for example, cloud computing to enable to bring tremendous power to the edge without requiring huge CapEx expenses.
Oh, I know. I love the story that Derek Gottfried, who works for the New York Times, is the guy who put the New York Times Historical Archive online. And he gave a very funny talk at our open source convention a few years back about how he originally put it on his credit card and his expense report, and it scaled up much faster than he thought people were liking. And he kind of said, well, I accidentally put an extra zero on the request for the number of servers. He kind of had to apologize. And before long, they saw what a great thing it was, and he got the official blessing. But it was the ability to do it without permission, to scale it up without any level of approval until it got big enough and important enough that they basically blessed it from the core. So it's exactly what you're talking about.
So that's fact one. The second factor now is how do you use social networks in order to amplify that power and actually let the edge be a more effective pull in terms of the outside world pulling resources to it. So one of our prime examples is in this room, SAP, and the whole way that NetWeaver got off the ground and how they've been able to use kind of their social network, developers network, to be able to pull now, 1.8 million people into the game of helping make NetWeaver into something phenomenal. And so it's a sense of saying we now have tools to empower the edge that we never had before. So the belief is, optimistic albeit, is because of cloud and because of social media, we may be able to empower the edge in ways never before possible. So we may be able to have agents of change if top management was willing to pull the kids with fire in their belly to the edge.
But there's still something here, a couple things I want to try to tease apart here. I see a lot of companies go wrong with social media. And they go wrong because they say, oh, this is wonderful way I can reach out, I can touch all these people. And perhaps it's because Twitter started reporting the number of followers that they got this idea that what really counted was how many people were on your list, the numbers. It's like, oh, you've got
What's yours, Tim? No.
Oh, sure. So they kind of think like it's still a broadcast medium.
Right.
And the advice that I always give is, what you're really trying to do, no matter, because I think about myself as a tweeter. I have lots of followers, but I can only put out so much content. And so the bulk of the content I try to put out are pointers to other people, because I'm actually trying to build their visibility, because there's a lot, I'm trying to get this thing to fan out. And I was talking earlier today with Andrew Zolli, who's the executive director of PopTech, and he said something that really struck me. He said, the first rule of networks is that you build them before you need them. and that's a little counterintuitive, but in a way, it makes sense. Where what you're really trying to do is to build this set of resources that could be used for many, many different purposes. But what drives the architecture of that network is usually some kind of goal. And that's why I want to kind of keep coming back to, the passion and work on what is hard. Because it seems to me that that's so much the core of the lesson. Everything else is a how,
Right.
But if you don't have that, if you're not trying to do something important, you easily get trapped into, well, it's about me, it's about my, company, my goals. Whereas if you really understand that it's about a mission, then you're building the network that can help you accomplish the mission. And the mission is way bigger than you as a company.
Right, and also your identity now becomes part of that mission in a very critical way, okay?
Yeah.
So, and in fact, you put your finger on perhaps the point that is most miseasily understood, because everybody says I'm passionate.
Yeah.
But they don't understand what does it mean to be passionate around extreme performance, and how in order to excel in extreme performance, you have to learn and you have to innovate and you have to improvise.
Right.
And so in some sense, the driver for innovation may be the pursuit of extreme performance. And if you don't have passion to do that, then basically you're going to be constrained by artificial barriers all around you.
Yeah.
So to us, I think this notion that passion is great, but passion for extreme performance is a fundamental mechanism driving innovation and advancement at the individual level.
Yeah.
And my identity now, becoming great at something that now builds something that other people can participate in and share with and so on and so forth, it's a very powerful dynamic that has been underplayed by a lot of the classical social media.
There's another piece to the passion, and you've kind of alluded to it, but I wanted to draw it out because it came through in terms of the shift index again, where we actually, one of the metrics we used was passion of workers, and most executives looked at us and said, wait, why are you looking at that? And one of the things that we showed in that shift index was a very strong correlation between the level of passion of a worker. And I should say, when we talk about passion of a worker, we're not talking about happiness. We're not talking about satisfaction. Often the passionate workers are the most unhappy, most frustrated people because they see all the potential and they see all the barriers that have been put in their place by this institution they're working with.
It takes HR a while to realize this.
Right. But the correlation, which was very powerful, and it ties into a broader theme in the book, was the most passionate people are the most connected people. They connect in all forms, whether it's going to conferences, whether it's going out to lunch with people outside their company, social media. They are more connected than people without passion. And if you believe, as we do, that the key to performance going forward is participating in knowledge flows, then if you don't have passionate people working for you, you will inevitably not be as effective in connecting to those knowledge flows.
Well, so you used a word that I wanted to spend a little time on. You spend a little time in the book talking about moving from the idea of stocks of knowledge to knowledge flows.
Right.
And of course that gets us into the whole area of how do we have to remake education. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, basically, everything we say about the 20th century industry also works for schooling. I mean, in a nutshell,
It is a push institution.
it's a push institution, okay? So push
We
institution.
got a big pile of stuff, and we're going to force feed it to you.
Right.
And we know exactly the minute you're born what you're going to learn in
Right.
2nd grade, 5th grade, 10th grade.
Right. So, I mean, in the 20th century, the mantra was, how do you build scalable efficiency inside the firm? Well, the same mantra is in the school system. How do we build scalable efficiency? We build actually factory models of schools, by and large. We look at how to optimize the delivery of knowledge to kids' heads, and pedagogy is how to get the perfect impedance match between this delivery engine and the kid who's the receptor. I mean, that's a bit hostile or hard, but it's probably accurate.
Well, my O'Reilly co-founder, Dale Doherty, wrote a piece on education called A Smart Grid for Informal Education. And in it, he wrote, schools are the coal-fired plants of our education grid.
Exactly. It's a wonderful piece of poetry, and unfortunately, it's more than poetry. But, you know, the catch is, can we just flip this whole thing around and think about it? You know, what do we mean to take learning on demand seriously?
Yeah.
Suppose basically you got engaged in something first, and you wanted to build something, okay, and you get stuck. Now you're situated in a stuck situation, and now at that point you're willing to pull resources, help, all kinds of things in to help you get unstuck. Well, now you have a very rich experiential learning moment, which is the exact opposite of being pushed course material. And so what we really see is kind of inverting this entire scheme, because, you know, basically we spend 12 to 20 years learning about something before we learn how to do something, learning to about versus learning to be. You know, what we're looking at is how do you learn to be by actually doing stuff that you care about, and then when you get stuck in that context, learn more.
So yeah, on-demand learning.
On-demand learning.
So, question here. So we, you know, drop out of school? Do we, you know, or is it just some people do this naturally? I certainly look in my own field. You know, the internet was largely built by self-taught people. You know, the reason they called them RFCs for the internet, request for comment, was because there was nobody in charge. And it was just a bunch of people going, well, this is how we were.
Small bunch, but yes.
Yeah. But you know, this is what we think we ought to do. Anybody think otherwise? You know, a lot of copying, a lot of imitation, a lot of sharing. You know, really self-directed learning. And now, you know, what you guys are documenting and seeing is that this is spreading, you know, to other industries. But put on your futurist hat for a minute. Where are we going with the future of, you know, and when you think about augmented reality, the ability to, you know, have situational learning. It's not going to be a matter of, you know, I mean, my company's been transferring knowledge with books and conferences, but in the future, I can easily imagine, you know, somebody, you know, wearing a pair of glasses where they can, you know, blink, you know, twice and pull up some relevant information. It's, you know, it's not as far off as we might think. You know, so what you actually need to know, you can literally pull in, not by running, as you said, running back up to the living room and watching the tape, but by getting the instant replay right into your, you know, retina.
Right. So you know,
how does that change? It's going to get faster.
I mean, you start with the notion of learning on demand, which is your premise. Okay. Second, you honor peer-based learning. So it helps to. I mean, you know, what is the best indicator of doing well in the university level? Not SATs, not any of the usual grade point averages. The best indicator is, do you know how to build a study group? Beginning and end of story.
No, I don't know. I was a total isolated nerd. I buried myself in bowels of
I understand now everything about you.
There are always outliers.
But I mean, like, and so you want to take that notion of the study group, I think, very seriously. Okay, so that you know, that's the second thing. Now you look at the kind of the power tools that are available, plus, you know, open education resources and all this kind of stuff. But the thing that we can't gloss too easily is the role of the mentor. Not the role of the teacher, the role of the mentor. Who got you hooked in something?
Yeah.
How do you help a kid to discover his or her passion? Okay, and that, you can leave it up to total serendipity, or you can say, well, no, can we actually scaffold and afford I mean, afford in the affordance sense of the word,
Yeah.
Gibson sense, helping these kids discover their passion.
Well, and also to cultivate it once they've discovered it.
Right, right, and in fact,
And also, I think there's a real role for a mentor to expose, talented young people to the world, to kind of show what they can do. 'Cause
So-
you can accelerate that process of discovery.
right, and so I think you're going to see something you might call concerted cultivation.
Yeah.
Okay, and how do you take that very seriously? Now, the curious thing to me is I like to think about going back to the future, and that's to say the one-room schoolhouse, there were no teachers, there were actually orchestrators, mentors, and facilitators. And how do you take something like that much more seriously? And now, and in fact, many of the teachers I know actually would prefer to be coaches and mentors. But they're bogged down in this factory model of education.
Yeah.
So we may actually find out that, with the right sets of tools, access to the right sets of things, we could flip this education system into things that a lot of teachers really passionately care
But
about.
how do you do that in the context of this massive institution that we have?
Well, I get you to come to Washington and scream. I think it's September 8th, is it? But
That's right. Yeah. Well, you're going to do that for us, right?
yeah,
Yeah. It is hard. It is, kind of comes back to, in the private sector, if a firm fails, its place is taken by somebody that's more vibrant and more attuned to what's needed today. It's very tough in the context of certain kinds of institutions because they don't self-destruct. They're kind of, they're baked in to the structure of our society.
So an interesting issue comes up, and you must have faced this in a different way, is you come up through this peer-based, bootstrapping kind of scheme we've been talking about. Where do your certificates come from?
Yeah.
Who certifies what you know? And our answer to that is, again, social media, we conceive, augmented reality, is how do you start giving portfolios of what you've actually done?
Absolutely. Well, you see this, certainly in the software arena, you hire somebody because of the code they've written, not because of the piece of paper they have.
Beginning in the story, precisely.
I remember hearing from one developer who said, when they were being asked about a certification, he said, "Well, I know that if somebody is asking for my certification, it's not a place I want to work." It's like, because they don't get it, And I think that it's absolutely based on what you can produce, and we do have that ability to show our work. And of course, this is not just in software these days. There's this whole DIY movement where we're coming back to, just-in-time manufacturing, new tools for manufacturing. There's some fascinating changes that kind of go top to bottom.
Have you ever kind of reflected on the notion that DIY, maybe the wrong term, maybe it's DIT, do it yourself versus do it together?
Yeah, actually, Scott Heiferman uses DIO, do it ourselves, for kind of group. Yes, I think there's a certain truth to that because it is ultimately a team and a network that gets anything big and hard done. Whether it's sort of the kind of peer learning that you talk about in the surfing story, or whether it's how do you grow from a small company to be a really big one. You've got to figure out how to build and collaborate.
And, much of the key to Park's success in the early days was the amount of diversity inside Park, Palo Alto Research Center. I mean, we had so many different disciplines that would then come together around a problem.
Yeah. So I think it's about time for us to take questions from the audience, and someone will be out there. While they're finding the first person, I want to ask you one last question, and that is, what did you guys most disagree about when you were writing the book? I've done co-authored books, so I know there's
When it had
always
to be
something
done. He's a slave master.
All right. We have a question out there? Okay. And please identify yourself, because again, part of what we're trying to do here is to build a network.
Are you going there? Or
Oh, I don't know. Over
I have
here.
the microphone, so I
Yeah,
guess
the
it's
mic,
me. Jeff Saperstein, great to have you. I'd ask you to flip this for a moment. If you look at the last 10 years and you look at the global economy, you have countries like Ireland that basically restructured everything to serve the multinationals without necessarily an insurance policy, that all that infrastructure and all that effort by Ireland when times got rough, that the companies would not pull out of Ireland or create havoc. Or you look at Fremont here, where the General Motors and the Toyota pulled out. And if you look at our country and you look at Europe and what's happening today, a lot of what you're talking about happens in the petri dish of innovation in a place like Silicon Valley. Perhaps you could address how this plays out, particularly in places like Europe, which have structure built into their society in companies such as the French companies, the German companies, the British companies, in which the societal component is quite important, and that this roller coaster that we seem to be going through on a continuous basis is far harder for the Europeans and us to handle than the Asians. I know you were talking, John, about being in Asia. So maybe you could address this from the other side in terms of what does this mean in terms of the social, economic health of the host countries or host regions in terms of everything you're talking about.
You know, let me just take like one slice at this, because, you know, to me, the key to the spirit, starting with Dusty as the surfer, is the willingness to fail, fail, fail again, in order to be able to find kind of the perfect move to make on the surf on this kind of wave, so on and so forth. That willingness to be able to risk, that willingness to be willing to get out of your comfort zone and to explore the edge when you don't know what's over there, is so critical to us in a world of flux. Is nice in the 20th century, but it may be survival in the 21st century. So we're very interested in the sense that and it goes to the very deep social issues we see in this country too, by the way, is that in this country, for better or for worse, most people are afraid of change. They run from change. Most corporations do not want to change. You know, ... The whole catch is, if you look at, and we take this very seriously, believe it or not, we look at things like World of Warcraft, or the gaming culture, and you look at what I'm going to call the questing disposition. To hardcore World of Warcraft gamers, basically, if I ain't learning, it ain't fun. I want change continuously. I want to be at the very edge of driving that change. Okay? So, interesting question, but we will come back to this in September at the summit, is what about how do you educate an entire generation, an entire society to embrace change rather than fear change? That is our challenge.
I know you're asking this question of JSB and John, but let me just weigh in a little bit, because I've been spending a chunk of time trying to think about how to influence government to think about these various principles. And one of the things that I found is that, you know, there are edges everywhere. You know, so yes, you look at monolithic states, you look at monolithic institutions, but when you get closer, it becomes fractal. So, for example, you know, in the government context, you know, I started looking first at the federal government, but then you think about the states. Oh, wait, there's 50 states. Oh, there's 50,000 cities. And so, for example, I'm working with an organization called Code for America, which is finding individual cities that are doing innovative things, trying to bind them together in a network, trying to get interested, cutting-edge kids to come work in those cities to push the envelope, and then have that stuff start to flow from city to city. I think it was Louis Brandeis who said, the states are the laboratories of democracy. Well, even more so today, the cities. And as Stuart Brand likes to say, this is the century of the city. And there's really interesting opportunities for us to start to reinvent from the bottom up of our institutions, from neighborhoods. Wonderful concept in Boston. The technology department there is called the Department of New Urban Mechanics. And it really is about, we actually got to try to, fix what's broken. And this sort of relentless focus on let's go figure out how to make this a better place. And I think that if you look at it from the center, from the monolith, your hair starts to fall out. If you look at it from the edge, you see all the, this vitality that starts to bring new life, and you just have to feed what's working.
And how the edge pulls resources from all over the place.
Yeah. So.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson with Spigot, the software startup, kind of the intersection of social media and innovation. And I wanted to get your reaction to one of the problems that we've seen. You haven't mentioned it, but it seems that the financial systems that we encounter, discounted cash flow, net present value, really mitigate against instinct. And you're talking about all these things that people are making decisions based on intuition, but our financial systems, because high-risk things with the discount that you have to apply to risk, really, people are not taking big risks anymore because all the financial systems we use to model opportunities are really mitigating against that. Stage-gated analysis works against that. So we've got all these tools out there that seem to be preventing intuition. And I just wondered kind of what your thoughts are about that.
People are taking huge risk. I think the problem is they're taking the wrong kind of risk. Frankly, what's been happening over the past couple of decades is we have in part compensated for this declining return on assets by increasing our debt as corporations, as individuals, as countries. And that is huge risk because that's a fixed obligation, and when things start to turn down, you end up paying the price, as we've learned in this economic downturn. So there's actually a very substantial risk, and we think there's a very different model which actually looks at, rather than financial leverage, capability leverage. How do you, in fact, find other people with complementary assets and resources and deliver more value to the marketplace? That actually serves you extremely well in an economic downturn when the pressure is to do more with less. And so I think that there's a need to reframe what is the risk. I agree with your point that most large companies think they're being risk averse and managing risk very carefully.
When in fact they're taking the biggest risk of
Yes.
all, which is to take no risks.
Right.
You look at a company like Amazon, and John's on the board of. I mean, Amazon, beaten up for its first decade because they were doing all this stuff that nobody could really see. And as it developed, of course, those enormous risks became. Oh wow! Where did that success come from?
Right.
Cloud computing. What the devil is a company that started as a book retailer, launching this cloud computing initiative? You look at Apple. Look at the kinds of risks that they took in just this uncompromising vision of how computing could be different. I think you look at any truly breakthrough company is not run by the numbers.
That's true. But let me put a small spin.
Solely by the numbers. You have to
Yes.
pay attention to the numbers,
Right.
but you don't start there.
Right.
Right.
But the way John answered your question is, notice, a lot of people ask us, why do we look at ROA instead of ROE? Everybody looks at the world through ROE. Well, ROE lets you do all kinds of fancy debt financing. And so we wanted to look at something, what are you doing with the hard assets, rather than the tricks you can play in the balance sheet. And that's why we wanted to strip away the games that are being played today, and just look at the core assets. And that's, by doing that, we unpacked this very devastating story that we are in serious trouble.
Hi, Jake Cross. Now you guys know I'm a learning guy, not a finance guy, but this return on assets measure, I have to question. Because it seems to me that the nature of assets has changed quite a bit during the period that you're talking about. Between 1980 and 1999, we flip-flopped from having the valuation of the S&P 500 be about 20% intangibles to be about 80% intangibles. And the only thing is that, the intangibles are not part of the ROA equation because accounting doesn't put any value on intellectual property and know-how and things like that. Doesn't that change the number because it is apples and
It
oranges?
Yeah,
radically changes the number. Go ahead.
It does change the numbers dramatically. So take whatever estimate you have for the value of these intangible assets, add it to the assets. What does that do to the return on assets? It goes even further south. Now, we've we're playing all kinds of games. So another game that's being played is we are stripping out, through outsourcing and offshoring, all the capital-intensive parts of our business, the asset-intensive parts of our business, manufacturing facilities, logistics networks. So we've stripped all those out in a desperate effort to reduce the number of assets we have. What's happened to return on assets? It's still going down. All these games are not producing any change to the bottom line performance of the business. So,
John, doesn't your book say that the sort of the half-life of an asset has been dropping, that things that used to be around for 30, 40 years are now around for 2 or 3? And I think there has to be a conversion cost of some sort if you're swapping the assets.
there are all kinds of adjustments you can make. God forbid, although I'm with Deloitte, I'm not going to defend the current accounting systems in terms of their representation of reality. Nevertheless, make any adjustments you want. The fundamental trend is not changing. And I'll just add another note, too, which one of the pushbacks we got was, well, this is, there's certainly 1 or 2 industries that are driving all this down. Maybe it's the automobile industry that's causing this overall return on asset decline. So we broke apart the U.S. economy into 13 different industries. And we said, let's look at all these industries and see what the trends are. In 11 out of the 13, there was a significant sustained erosion in return on assets. What were the 2 industries that were exceptions? Aerospace and defense, and healthcare. I'll leave it to another discussion as to why that might be. But.
And there is a reason.
And there is a reason.
What you're after. But Jay, I think the other thing, where we're jointly pushing on the same agenda is that the 20th century, as I said, the corporate mantra is scalable efficiency. In the 21st century, given the shrinking half-life of any particular skill or asset value, then the game is going to be scalable learning. By the way, scalable knowledge creation. Okay? And so that is, but we have not taken that seriously in the corporate world. We don't structure corporations that way.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. If you guys say that push is in and pull is the new black, what do you say about Twitter from learning perspective? Is Twitter a learning network?
So what do we say?
Did you hear?
Is Twitter a learning network from push perspective?
Twitter.
Oh, it's Twitter. Is Twitter a learning network?
In fact, when Tim told his story, I thought about a tiny piece of irony because he pushes the message out, but in order to let these assets out there pull people.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're actually announcing, here is a resource, and let me pull as many people as possible to this interesting new resource.
Yeah.
And so your end result is pull, even if you use the beginning push.
Well, I think also there are many, many different ways to use Twitter.
Yeah.
And, everything from, the assembly of resources. If you look at, for example, the Haiti disaster relief, people were reporting, there's somebody trapped under a building here. So there was a lot of ad hoc coordination. There's certainly a lot of knowledge discovery, people asking questions, building, networks. And certainly there are people who are using it in more of a broadcast mode. But I think it's one of many, many tools that allow you to build and maintain a much larger and more distributed network. One of the things that I think that we see in the progress of technology is that the power of an individual to maintain and manage a large network is really amplified by these technologies today. You can keep in touch, with many, many people. You can coordinate large activities. You don't have to be in the same place at the same time. You look at world-changing pieces of software like Linux, and I always used to say, oh my gosh, this guy in Finland and his right-hand man was a guy in Wales, and these 2 guys are collaborating on building this piece of software that ended up, changing the face of the computer industry. Wales? Come on, when was the last time that or look at Skype, came out of Estonia. So again, this ability of of people all around the world to connect, to collaborate, to build these ad hoc networks. And I think things like Twitter and Facebook are, even though they start looking just like, consumer, just for fun, trivial kind of networks, end up becoming extremely powerful, lightweight coordination tools.
Rich Miller, Telematica. I'd like the next time you go around on this, John and John, to think about the new definition for ROA. Tim mentioned the fact that networks need to be put in place for a purpose. What about those assets that have already been depreciated or deprecated on which then we rely? We had a lot of dark fiber that showed up and a lot of communications capacity following the burst of the first bubble. That has in fact created something of a golden age for a lot of us who went in and built on the top of these kinds of networks and relied on them. So the networks, or the network infrastructure, may have been put in place in advance for a purpose. It just wasn't the purpose that we're now using it for.
Right.
Going back to ROA, maybe the return on assets is return on assets the second and third time they're being used.
I mean, let me just give you the small wrinkle on that. As you know, the fiber is actually the cheap part. It's the amplifiers and the drivers, and you add those incrementally. And so that's where a lot of your money goes, unknown to most people.
Yeah.
So the story gets complicated.
Yeah, I will say one thing about this idea of reusing lost assets. One, if you're not familiar with, there's a wonderful book called Technological Revolutions in Financial Capital that describes that process. Almost every golden age of technology is preceded by a bubble in which financial capital was misallocated to build out all kinds of stuff that went bust, but was then later useful. But I also want to take that all the way to the other end of the DIY world. If you really want to be inspired, you should read a blog called AfriGadget. It's all about the kind of reuse that you see in the third world of things that we would consider just complete trash.
Right.
And they're turning it into amazing, functional, powerful objects that improve their society. And,
And fit within their practices.
right, and fit within their practices. And there's so much for us to learn about reusing assets. And I do think that we're at a point in our, the arc of our society. My son-in-law, Saul Griffith, once said he thought that perhaps 2008 was the year of peak waste. And it'd be nice to think that that's true, that we're starting to learn that we have to, reuse our assets, and we can't just keep throwing things away.
A curious turn on that is maybe we're entering the era of bricolage.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thought.
Yeah.
Good evening, David McCulloch with Cisco. JSB, you mentioned earlier on that maybe it was un-American or alien to Americans to learn from our networks or learn from networks. And maybe you're inferring that our culture, which prizes great individual accomplishment and recognizes great leaders for their great individual contributions, is at a disadvantage when it comes to learning from the edge versus maybe societies that prize more collective achievement. So the question is, are you optimistic about our ability to change and to flip models around and to learn from the edge? And if you're not, do you think that's maybe a generational thing, and that as the next generation leaders that come up that are growing up, collaborating more, that we'll see more optimism about our ability to do so?
So I think two quick comments. I mean, one, I think the kids born digital are inherently this way. And so you are finding kids more and more whose identity comes from what they build and share with others, and others build on. My sense of self comes to that process. Okay? My sense of self does not come from what clothes I wear, what I own, and so on and so forth. And so you find a whole new social dynamic and psychodynamic unfolding here that I find is extremely healthy, and I think is the foundations of your DIY movement, DIO, DIT movement. So, you know, that's really good. I think the other side of it is that corporations are going to suddenly realize that their assets, going back to you know, comes Jay, et cetera, do lie in people that are passionate. And they're going to find new ways to unleash them on the edge. And in fact, as I tried to indicate earlier, the edge can now be empowered in ways that were unthinkable 5 years ago. You can't begin to understand what cloud computing enables us to do on the edge. Now couple that to social media, it is a new game. So I think we have power tools, the likes of which are almost unimaginable, that are very, very new, that had not been here before.
And you ain't seen nothing yet because it's going to keep going.
Yes. Oh, you like that exponential?
I still think it's sigmoidal at some point.
Okay.
Okay.
David Gerard with Right Management. John Hagel, a question for you. You talked about in your years of work in change management that you found that organizations tend to respond primarily to a crisis of some kind. And I'm curious, in terms of looking at the concept of the edge and the core, what is the pathway for, let's say, a young organization, an entrepreneurial organization that maybe is starting out today, to do things right?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. And I'll actually go back to China for a minute, because there was a view, and I worked with senior executives about 10 or 15 years ago and started talking about China. And the answer I would get when I started talking about what's going on there was, John, you got to understand there are two things in China that will make sure they never, ever sustain this kind of growth. One is they don't have a well-developed financial system, so they can't possibly get funding for the kind of growth they need. And number two, they don't have any intellectual property protection. So if they come up with something innovative, it gets copied immediately. There's no incentive to keep going. Actually, what the Chinese companies that we've looked at have done is take those two deficits and turned them into strengths. They said, okay, we don't have a financial system that supports private entrepreneurial activity. That means we have to focus ruthlessly on only those things that we can do ourselves and get anybody else who's got complementary resources and connect out to them. And number two, if we don't have intellectual property protection, we've got to move as rapidly as possible to get that next wave of innovation in place before those people start copying what we already have. And I think that's in part an indirect way of answering your question, which is my experience is that as companies get larger, they get what I call the curse of the deep pocket. And it has two forms. One is the thought that since we have a lot of resources, we can do a lot more. And you lose that discipline about what is it that only you can do, and that anything else has to be sourced from somebody else. And number two, you get this notion of you have to go for something that's truly breakthrough, that's going to move the needle, because as you get larger, you have a harder and harder time having impact on the overall financials of the company without having a true, real breakthrough. And you lose this sight of rapid incremental innovation, which I think is a key driver of performance in this new world. So I think those would be two key pieces of advice. And then the other piece is figure out how you can develop talent more rapidly than anybody else. One of the things we've talked about in the book is what we call the Dilbert Paradox, which is the notion that ask any top CEO what their priorities are, and inevitably, if it's not the top, it's within the top three. Talent is our most important priority. And if that's the case, the paradox is, how do you explain the enormous popularity of these popular culture items like Dilbert and The Office that so vividly communicate the stultifying effect of our daily work environments on talent? That's a paradox. We think part of the answer to that paradox is if you ask the next question, okay, talent's your most important priority, what are you doing about it? Most of the executives would answer, it's about attracting and retaining talent. We are totally focused on getting the best world-class talent wherever it is and bringing it in. And then secondly, if there's any indication they're going to leave, we do whatever we can to hold on to them. They lose that middle piece, which we believe is where the power is, which is how do you develop talent more rapidly than anybody else. If you do that, you're going to attract more talent than you can possibly handle. Word of mouth will spread that you develop talent better than any place else. And why would they leave? They're developing faster than they would anywhere else. So again, that would be another piece of advice. As companies get larger, they tend to lose that focus on developing talent more rapidly than anybody else.
John, you get the gold star for practical applied business advice in tonight's panel. That was great. Thanks. Okay, over here.
Yeah. Carl, good to see you, JSB. So anyway, it's not only in our organizations and our offices where we have dysfunctionality. Nationally, we seem to, at least in this state, we seem to have the failed state. And nationally, we seem to be pretty dysfunctional politically. The Chinese seem to have an alarming number of technologists and engineers on their Politburo. Is there anything in your book that can be used to help us resolve the dysfunctionality of our political processes?
No, I think it's in Shakespeare. Sorry? I think it's in Shakespeare. Isn't it first we kill all the lawyers?
You know, let me offer one observation on that, and it's not an answer, but I think it heads in the right direction, which again builds on my earlier comment about talent development. What if we took every public policy debate that's going on in the United States today and said, and put it through the lens of talent development? What is the impact of the various policy options on talent development? Will talent develop faster, or will it develop slower? And maybe we want to choose the policies that are going to drive talent development more rapidly. And that is a different frame. You know, most of these debates never talk about talent development, unless you're talking about the educational system, when that's the one area where you start to talk about talent. But take it into financial policy, take it into trade policy, take it into immigration policy, intellectual property policy. What are the policy options that would drive talent development more rapidly? Maybe we could start to build a coalition and consensus around those policy options. Might be a way of reframing.
There is something else, though, John. Talent for what? Take Goldman Sachs. They may say, "Oh yeah, we're looking for talent, and we're going to develop our talent, more rapidly than anyone else." But
fair.
What is the big aim? Again, I want to keep coming back to this thing you said earlier, which is, extreme performance in pursuit of. I think it needs to be said, in pursuit of something worthwhile.
Something worthwhile. Yeah, that may not be univocal, but
yeah.
But both you, Tim, and I, to give it a little tiny bit of optimism to Carl, if that's possible, that is kind of the techie guys in the government today, I would say Vivek, Anish, etc., actually get this story amazingly well.
Yeah.
And the question is, as we blow open government to open government, and now look at these streams that are coming out, what's the ability to be able to actually construct dashboards so the dashboards can be created for each person in government to kind of measure what they're actually getting done and so on and so forth. And so the idea of the dashboard is not for management to look at you, but rather the dashboard becomes, in John's sense, how do you build this as a reflective medium for yourself? And you pick up some of those ideas, believe it or not, from World of Warcraft, which we can now actually show the exponential increase of talent, of capability in that game, from using things like these dashboards. And so it's very interesting. This dovetails completely with the open government, the transparency, and this thing. So I think we're on the verge of being able to...
There's some really remarkable stuff happening in Washington. Just for example, one that we've been working on, the CIO of the Army, he's really fixated on the idea of innovation from the edge and how do they enable that. We started with this little contest called Apps for Army, just where they're trying to solicit innovative techniques, tools from soldiers that will help them achieve their mission on the ground. But they're really starting to use that idea as the basis for thinking about an entire transformation of the way they do development of IT capabilities.
And look at the book Company Command.
Yeah.
that actually is really trying to formalize this whole notion of the edge in the Army.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of innovation happening there for sure, and I think some of that is driven just by circumstances. You know, the nature of
necessity.
warfare today. You know, they say, wait a minute, we can't do a 5 to 7 year procurement for some new technique. You know, on the ground in Afghanistan, we've got to figure it out then and there. So we've got to enable the edge.
Right.
And you know, I think it's happening all through government right now. We're in an incredibly fertile period, and I just hope that the political, you know, pressures don't shut down the stuff that's happening.
Hi,
Okay,
Mark
I think
Bennett.
this is going to be our last question. I'm getting.
Just in time. Mark Bennett from Oracle Corporation. And first a note to the folks in the room that if you're interested in finding out more about Li and Feng, there's a great book by Victor Feng called Competing in a Flat World, and it's an eye-opener in terms of transparency. He basically lays out their entire business model fully for you to examine. So I think it goes well to what both John and John had said about the way they approach business. My question is, just to connect the dots, you mentioned earlier this thing versus financial leverage. You said capability leverage. And then later on, you talked about talent development. We're talking about the same thing?
Very much so. I think that one of the key themes that we develop is, in addition to the notion of focusing on talent development, don't just focus on developing talent within your own organization. It's the old Bill Joy observation, no matter how many smart people you have in your company, just remember there are a lot more smart people outside. So the question is, how do you connect? First of all, how do you identify those people? One question I often ask executives is, can you identify the 10 smartest people in your market or industry? Most of them have a hard time. And then secondly, do you know them? Have you built relationships with them? And ultimately, are you building relationships where you are both improving your performance more rapidly as a result of that relationship than you would if you weren't in that relationship?
So both, going both ways.
Yes. And so that's a key theme in the book, is this notion that talent development, if it works right, is not just about developing the talent in your organization. It's developing talent wherever it is through relationships that you're building.
Reciprocity is a key theme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You will see it play out at all kinds of different levels, 3 different levels in our book.
I just want, before we wrap up, a little advertisement. If any of you have stamina and passion after all the festivities here are over, a group of us are going to be convening over at the Palo Alto Wine Room at 520 Ramona Street in Palo Alto for a little bit of additional drinks and conversation. So we invite any of you who are interested to join us over there.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I'm not a big fan of a lot of business books, but this is a really worthwhile one, and I highly recommend that you get it and read it. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our speakers for this inspiring and provocative conversation. I hope that people out there are ready to go and live on the edge. And as a symbol, and as a symbol of our thanks, we have this edgy Churchill Club T-shirt for you.
Oh, excellent.
Please
Thank
wear
you.
it in good health. A
Thank
reminder that the books are available just outside the auditorium. And want to thank Deloitte once again, and thank all of you for coming. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
You know the time could be just beat the track runners. Keep it moving when I catch my breath. I'm not your average college.